You're 34, on a therapist's couch. You've already said, "I don't know," twice. She asks what your childhood was like. "Nothing happened," you say. That sentence is the whole problem. Nothing happened isn't neutral. It's information. People with bad childhoods don't say that. They come in with PowerPoints. You don't, because what was missing was never dramatic. Just something you built your whole personality around without realizing it was gone. 6 gaps, including one that starts in an ordinary kitchen on an ordinary Tuesday, that decide whether you grow up knowing how to need people or weirdly proud you don't. 1. The love that never asked how you were doing. Your parents loved you. This is not in question. They fed you. They showed up to things. They worried about your future at 2 a.m. in a way that would actually wreck you if you knew the full extent of it. But there's a specific thing love doesn't automatically include. Psychologist Jonice Webb spent 20 years in private practice watching it quietly destroy people who had no language for what was wrong. She calls it childhood emotional neglect. The failures of parents to respond enough to a child's emotional needs. Not respond cruelly, respond enough. It's more common than people think. Roughly 1 in 5 adults, which means someone watching this right now is already recognizing themselves. Here's what it looks like in real life. You come home from school. Something awful happened. The social kind of awful that's catastrophic at 11 years old. Your parents making dinner, half listening, and says, "You'll be fine. You got any homework? I love you, but I'm currently sauteing onions and cannot emotionally process this." And you were probably fine, eventually, but your brain filed something away in that moment. Feelings are something I can handle alone. Feelings equal DIY project. No instructions, no tools, just vibes. You did that enough times, and by the time you're an adult sitting on a therapist's couch, you genuinely don't know what you're feeling. Not as a coping strategy, as a fact. You reach in to find the answers, and there's just static. That's the first gap. Love without attunement. And once that installs, you don't just handle feelings alone, you start removing them entirely. 2. The be strong household. Some families don't dismiss feelings on purpose. Feelings just aren't on the menu. Right between "don't make a scene" and "pass the salt without expressing a need." You scrape your chair too loud and everyone notices, but nobody says anything about what just happened. Nobody cries at the table. Nobody talks about fear. Anger gets swallowed mid-sentence. Grief is handled quickly and privately, like a paperwork problem. These aren't cold families. They're often warm, funny even, deeply loyal. They just collectively agreed, without ever saying so, that emotions are weather you weigh out, not something you walk through together. You got very good at compressing. You became the kid who was so mature, emotionally self-employed at age 9. No benefits, no support, somehow full-time. The one nobody had to worry about. Which sounds like a compliment until you realize what it cost you. The adult version of this is a particular kind of loneliness that's almost impossible to explain to someone who hasn't felt it. You're surrounded by people who love you, and you feel like you're watching the scene from 2 feet behind your own head. They stop. They don't decide to stop. They just stop. By adulthood, they're fluent in everyone else's feelings and a stranger to their own. The therapist asks, "What do you feel right now?" And you say, "I don't know." And you mean it completely. That's the second gap. And if you're thinking, "That's not me," wait until the third one. That's where most people recognize themselves. 3. The parent who was present but somewhere else. This one is the cruelest gap because it's the least visible, and it's the one people defend the hardest. Your parent was there, physically there, at the table, at the game, in the house, but they were also inside something. stress, depression, their own unresolved history, a marriage held together mostly by routine and mutual exhaustion. Their body showed up. Their emotional attention was somewhere else entirely. And here's the part that messes people up later. You, because you were a child, and children are astonishingly perceptive, picked up on the gap between the person sitting across from you and the person you actually needed. You reached out and something came back, but it wasn't quite right. Like a phone call with a half-second delay. Close enough to confuse you, far enough to leave you always slightly unsatisfied in ways you couldn't name. Which is rude because you've been doing emotional check-ins like it's a job requirement. Dr. Daniel Siegel, a neuropsychologist at UCLA, describes how emotional unavailability shapes the wiring that decides how much you think you matter. The brain learns what it repeatedly experiences. A child who repeatedly reaches for emotional contact and finds distance learns that intimacy lives right at the edge of your fingertips. Close, but somehow never quite there. The adult version is the person who's excellent at the early stages of relationships and quietly terrified of the deep ones, who calls independence a personality trait when it's actually a scar shaped exactly like the distance they grew up with. You are extraordinarily good at being the person who doesn't need anything, and you've built an entire identity around that, because the alternative feels like falling off a ledge you've never seen the bottom of. Not cold parents, absent parents. There's a difference. And therapy is often where you finally learn what it is. 4. The praise that tracked performance and went quiet otherwise. When you brought home the A, the room lit up. When you scored, the energy shifted. When you got in, they told relatives. And when you were just there, ordinary Tuesday you, doing homework, eating cereal, being 11, the room was the same temperature it always was. You didn't notice this happening. You just notice what gets attention and what doesn't. Ordinary me doesn't register, which is inconvenient because that's most of your life. So you learn something dangerous. Being yourself doesn't get you connection. Performing does. You become a person who is excellent at achievement. And spiritually sponsored by What's Next? Chasing the feeling your whole life, and every time you catch it, it lasts about 45 minutes. The therapist calls it the hedonic treadmill. You call it, I don't understand why nothing feels like enough. Same gap. 4th one. And the last 2 are where this stops being about childhood and starts explaining your entire adult life. 5. The family that looked fine. Some of the most emotionally expensive childhoods happen in families that look completely fine from the outside. Conflict managed, not processed. Tension handled with silence and surface warmth. The unspoken rule that everything's okay, and asking if they aren't is somehow the ruder thing to do. You were the easy one. You were accommodating, which sounds great until you realize what it trained. Which is great for everyone else and terrible for your future therapist's schedule. Dr. Jonice Webb's research describes this pattern in detail. The well-meaning but neglected themselves parent category. Parents who genuinely loved their kids and genuinely couldn't access what their kids emotionally needed because nobody had ever modeled it for them. The chain just keeps moving. Quietly, generation to generation. Not cruelty, absence. And absence is harder to argue with because there's nothing obvious to point at. An inheritance nobody asked for. Passed down along the holiday recipes and the silence everyone agreed to keep. Not officially, just nobody broke the rule. The adult cost shows up when things go wrong. You handle it. You always handle it so automatically that the people around you forget to check in because you've never given them a reason to think you wouldn't be fine. And somewhere around 34, sitting on a couch, you realize you've never once let anyone actually help you. You've been emotionally assembling IKEA furniture ever since that first DIY project in childhood, and you don't know if that's strength or if it's armor you forgot you were wearing. The therapist calls this compulsive self-reliance. You've called it a personality trait your entire life. That's the fifth gap. 6. What your parents couldn't give you, they never had. Most parents who created these gaps were running their own emotional deficits, which would be comforting if it didn't explain so much. They also compressed. They also grew up reaching for a connection that was close, but not quite there. They weren't withholding, they were empty in specific ways they couldn't even see, like trying to pour water from a cup that's also asking for water and thinks that's normal. This pattern repeats quietly, automatically, and nobody in the chain thinks they're the problem. The therapy room is where someone finally asks you what you needed as a child. And the strange, disorienting thing that happens in that room, the thing that makes grown adults cry about things that happened 25 years ago in kitchens they no longer live in, is the realization that you never asked yourself that question before, not because you were avoiding it, because nobody taught you that you were allowed to have an answer. So you didn't ignore your needs, you never learned how to look for them. That's the sixth gap, and it might be the most important one. 7. The belief that fine is the same as okay. You built a life, a very functional, high-performing, emotionally mysterious life, even to you. And you walk into therapy thinking, nothing bad happened, which sounds comforting until you realize it explains absolutely nothing. Love is a floor, a necessary, real, life-giving floor. Your parents gave you that. Attunement is the ceiling, being seen when you're not winning anything. Having your feelings treated like they matter in the moments when you're not performing anything impressive. Learning that you're allowed to need things and that needing them won't cost you connection. When the ceiling is missing, you don't notice immediately. You don't have anything to compare it to. You just live on the floor and tell yourself it's a perfectly fine place to live. Until one day you're 34, sitting on a couch, and someone asks you how you feel. And you realize you have genuinely never been sure. That's not a character flaw. That's the absence you were never taught how to notice. And the fact that you're in that room at all, asking the question, trying to find the answer, means the chain stops with you. Your parents loved you. That was real. That counted. And so does this. If this hit, watch your kid learn to be alone you didn't notice. Same pattern, just earlier and easier to miss.